Hello, friends. Come closer. Find your most comfortable place, perhaps under a warm blanket, a cup of tea in hand, or just the quiet hum of night surrounding you. Tonight, we set out together on a slow and thoughtful journey, a gentle drift across centuries, through forgotten lives and resilient hearts. Let the outside world soften. Let the flicker of screens dim, the weight of the day grow lighter, and your mind grow still. You are invited, not just to listen, but to wander, with curiosity and kindness, as we open the pages of stories rarely told in full. Stories about the quiet endurance of ordinary people and the hidden strength in lives lived simply but bravely. As you listen, tell me, if you'd like, where in the world you are. What time is it where you are listening? Are the stars high above you, or is the sun just beginning to rise? Somewhere someone is tuning in from a quiet farmhouse, someone else from a city apartment. Perhaps you're here with your pet curled beside you, or alone in your own peaceful space. Wherever you are, you're not alone. We're all gathering together across continents and time zones, bound by a shared wonder for the past. Tonight, we'll drift through 4 remarkable moments, woven not with the drama of conquest or kings, but with the quiet power of human survival. You'll meet a medieval peasant family curled close against the bitter cold, their thatched roof barely holding back the frost. You'll hear whispers of a queen, her eyes not just on her court, but on the centuries to come. A single act of resistance by one ordinary man will ripple outward, defying the weight of an empire. And then, the sands will part to reveal a city older than history books once believed possible, peaceful, complex, and buried by time. But first, let's begin at the edge of winter. You see where we sit now, safe, warm, wrapped in duvets or hoodies with thermostats quietly humming in the background. We rarely think about how truly brutal cold can be. Real cold. The kind that bites into bone. The kind that keeps you awake at night not because of thoughts or dreams, but because your body simply can't stop shivering. Now imagine that it's not just one night, but months. Imagine that your walls are made of mud and sticks. Your floor is frozen earth, and your only insulation is the memory of sunlight long gone. No thick blankets, no central heating, no electric lights. Just the wind pressing against your door, and the constant question of whether your family will make it through the next snowstorm. This is where we begin, with those who had the least, and yet survived some of history's harshest winters, not through technology or wealth, but with cleverness, community, and the sheer force of will. Their story is not grand in the way history is often told, but it is grand in heart, in courage, and in its quiet defiance of the elements. And so, let's travel now, gently and slowly, into their world. Let's open the door to a night-long past and see how the human spirit found warmth, even when the fire had burned low. The wind had teeth. It didn't just blow, it bit. It clawed its way through every loose seam, every crooked timber, every forgotten crack in the walls of a fragile medieval hut. Inside, a small peasant family huddled close, wrapped in whatever layers they could find. Wool tunics worn thin from years of wear, rough blankets patched over and over again. There was no fireplace roaring, no insulation holding back the bitter chill. Just a single smoldering ember in the hearth, barely giving off warmth, its dull glow barely holding the darkness at bay. This was not a winter of snowmen and cozy firesides. This was survival under siege. Outside, the night was a howling creature, and the hut, if one could even call it that, was little more than a basket held up against a storm. The walls, made of sticks and packed mud, were no match for the wind. Each gust made the entire structure groan. The thatched roof above shifted and trembled, letting in the cold like a thief slipping through the rafters. And still, they endured. A mother, her breath visible in the air, curled protectively around her youngest. The child's face was pale, nose red from the cold, fingers tucked into her mother's sleeves. Nearby, an older sibling stirred in half-sleep, teeth chattering beneath a fraying woolen wrap. Their father, back hunched from labor, lay close to the door, his position not of comfort, but of protection. Ever alert to the cold's quiet invasions or worse, the threat of wandering thieves. There were no thermostats to turn up, no vents to stand over with outstretched palms. Even the firewood was precious, too precious to burn without cause. Every stick, every bundle of dried grass had to be rationed like food, and so they lay mostly still, conserving heat not by flames, but by the press of their bodies. Human warmth was the only defense against the kind of cold that froze water indoors and turned breath into frost on the walls. The cold left marks. Frost-bitten toes, cracked lips, and skin rubbed raw from too much wool and too little washing. Illness lingered like smoke in the air, coughs never quite gone, fevers rising with no cure but time and prayer. And yet, when morning came and they stirred to find each other still breathing, it was nothing short of a miracle. Not a dramatic one, not the kind sung by minstrels or etched into stained glass, but a quiet, stubborn miracle all the same. And they never complained. There was no time for bitterness, no luxury of self-pity. Life was harsh, and winter harsher still, but the peasants faced it with a kind of weathered courage that only those who have no choice can understand. They didn't talk about how unfair it was. They gathered their rags tighter, adjusted their positions, and waited for the thaw. They worked when they could, rested when they had to, and did what had to be done. The cold was the enemy, but giving up was never an option. What stands out is not just their survival, but the calm with which they accepted it all. Not resignation, something stronger, a sort of wisdom born from generations of facing the same storm, year after year, and still finding a way to greet the sunrise. But as we linger in their frozen world, one thing becomes clear. Their courage alone was not enough. To truly endure, they had to get creative. Their homes, the very places meant to offer shelter, were working against them. And so, with little more than scraps, instincts, and each other, they began to fight back. Not with might, but with cleverness. Imagine, if you will, a house stitched together by necessity. Its walls are not built but woven, branches interlaced like the ribs of a basket, then smeared over with layer after layer of mud, straw, and a generous helping of what might politely be called nature's reluctant glue: animal dung. This was the wattle and daub hut, the medieval peasant's fortress against the elements. Though fortress might be giving it too much credit. It was more like a patchwork quilt stitched with hope and mud, permeable, sagging, and always on the verge of falling apart. These homes were not constructed with grandeur or permanence in mind. They were temporary by design and humble by necessity. A frame of timber, flexible wattle woven like netting between posts, and then smeared over with the daub, a mixture that clung desperately to the walls, trying its best to keep out the wind. On good days, it worked just well enough to be considered shelter. On bad days, it was about as effective as holding up a loaf of bread to stop a river. The wind was a frequent, unwelcome visitor. It didn't knock. It simply walked in through the cracks, like an entitled guest who had long since lost any sense of manners. It found the gaps between the timbers, slipped through the seams where the daub had fallen away, and swept across the room with the casual cruelty of nature unchecked. No matter how tightly the walls were patched, the wind always seemed to know another way in. But peasants were not ones to surrender to the elements. They responded not with lumber or bricks. They had none. But with imagination and sheer will. They pressed moss into the cracks with numb fingers, pushed old cloth and straw into every breach, sealing holes with whatever scraps could be spared. It wasn't elegant, and it wasn't always effective, but it was undeniably human, a quiet kind of brilliance born from trial, error, and a deep need to simply get through one more night. You might have seen a child tasked with hunting down drafts, crawling along the floor with a piece of smoldering straw, watching to see where the smoke twisted and danced. That would tell them where the cold crept in. And once found, the hole would be stuffed with rags, bundled reeds, or clumps of earth. Some families even used dried animal hair or shredded bark, anything really to slow the enemy wind. In places where the daub had fallen off entirely, they would hang old tunics or tack up bits of sackcloth like sad little curtains. From the inside, it must have looked like the wall itself had caught a cold and was trying to wrap up in old clothes. Still, this chaotic patchwork was often the only line of defense between the family and the full wrath of winter. It wasn't strong, it wasn't pretty, but it was something. And in those times, something was always better than nothing. But even with the walls more or less sealed, another problem loomed, one that seeped up from beneath them. Because for all their effort to stop the cold from coming through the walls, there was little to stop it from rising under them. The floor beneath their feet wasn't wood or stone, it was the earth itself, frozen, damp, and unforgiving. And that too would demand its own kind of ingenuity. Beneath the patched walls and sagging roof of the peasant's hut lay perhaps the cruelest part of their home, the floor. It wasn't made of stone or wood or even packed brick. It was simply dirt, earth as bare and unyielding as the winter sky above. When the frost came, it came first from below. The ground hardened to iron, and from it rose a chill that clung like damp fog, wrapping itself around toes and ankles, creeping silently into the bones like a thief with icy fingers. There was no escape from it, no boundary between skin and soil, but what the peasants could manage to place there. They would scatter straw, rushes, or hay across the ground, building layers as one might layer defenses in a siege. But the battle was always uneven. The makeshift flooring crackled underfoot, brittle and coarse. It felt like walking across dried paper or sleeping atop a broken bird's nest. Uneven, fragile, and destined to collapse under the weight of time and use. And collapse it did. The straw didn't stay clean or crisp for long. Within days, it grew soft with rot or damp with condensation. In time, it became a living ecosystem of its own, home to fleas, lice, and the occasional bold rat looking for warmth or crumbs. The smell turned from earthy to sour, a pungent mixture of mold, decay, and the slow fermentation of the very materials meant to offer comfort. Still, it was better than nothing. Every night, the family would add to it, tossing down fresh rushes when they could, rearranging them in an attempt to create dry spots. Children would curl into the shallowest hollows, where their own bodies had worn a slight curve into the straw and soil. But even then, the cold seeped in. Always. Even the thickest bed of straw couldn't stop the earth from whispering its icy threats upward. And beds, in the traditional sense, were out of the question. A mattress was a fantasy, a wooden platform, a luxury reserved for lords. For the peasant, sleep was had on a nest of brittle dreams, piled straw or animal skins, maybe an old cloak if one was lucky. They slept in their clothes not for modesty but for survival. Sometimes a thin layer of frost would form on the edges of blankets or sleeves left too close to the walls. In the worst winters, waking in the morning came with a kind of painful relief. Because waking, in itself, was never guaranteed. The sensory world of that floor was unforgettable. The straw crunched and shifted with every movement. Feet emerged in the morning blackened with dirt and speckled with bites. And still, the peasant would rise, stretch out stiff limbs, and begin the day's work, knowing they would return to the same cold floor that night. It wasn't a bed, it was a battlefield, a nightly challenge issued by the season itself. Yet amidst this discomfort, there was one defiant ember of hope, the hearth. A small flickering flame in the center of the hut that offered more than heat. It was the pulse of the home, the rallying point of warmth and light in a world determined to freeze them out. However meager the fire, however smoky the room, the hearth was survival made visible. And it is there, beside that stubborn flame, that our next chapter begins. In a world made brittle by frost, where every breath turned to mist and walls groaned beneath the weight of winter, the hearth stood as more than a source of warmth. It was the soul of the home. A flickering pulse against the dark, it glowed low in the center of the peasant's hut, casting amber shadows that danced along the wattle and daub walls. It did not roar, it rarely blazed, but it lived. And because it lived, so did they. The fire was never guaranteed. Without a chimney, smoke curled through the hut like a restless spirit, stinging eyes and blackening beams. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and scorched rushes. And yet, this acrid haze was welcome, a sign that the embers still smoldered. At times, the fire seemed to falter, shrinking to the size of a coin, its glow buried beneath ash and worry. Then came the rustling urgency of hands scraping together twigs, dry moss, anything that might coax it back from the brink. Everyone had their role in this quiet ritual. The children, small and nimble, fetched kindling from damp corners or clutched precious firewood like treasure. The mother would kneel beside the hearth, her fingers moving with practiced care, stirring the coals as if tending to an ailing child. The father watched over it with a silent vigilance, knowing that the loss of flame might mean the loss of far more. There were no formal prayers, those were for church, but sometimes there were whispered pleas to the flames, breathless promises made in the stillness of the hut. Just hold on, just until morning. The hearth gave more than heat, it gave light, and with it a sense of orientation in a world stripped of color and comfort. It was where stories were told, not as luxuries, but as anchors, tales of saints, lost kin, or strange beasts in the forest served to keep the children's minds from the cold. Faces turned toward the fire not only for warmth, but for a shared moment of humanity, eyes reflecting the same glimmer, hearts beating in quiet unison. Yet the fire was always hungry, always fading. And when night pressed hardest against the walls, there came the most vital task of all, banking the fire. This was not simply placing wood upon flame. It was a careful science born of desperation. Coals were pushed together, ashes heaped over them to preserve their heat, like wrapping a baby in thick blankets. Too much ash, and it would smother. Too little, and the cold would claim it. In this hushed act lay their final hope. A well-banked fire might survive until dawn, allowing them to stir it awake with breath and twig. A failed one meant waking to ice and silence, fingers too stiff to strike flint, children huddled and pale before the sun had even risen. So each night ended with breath held and fingers crossed. A family gathered around a pulse of fire, not for comfort, but for the right to face another day. And as the last flickers disappeared beneath the ash, they turned inward, wrapping themselves in cloaks and closeness, and waiting in the dark for a miracle of ember and dawn. When night closed in and the hut fell silent, the fire could not be trusted to care for itself. Its light was more than warmth. It was a lifeline stretched thin across the hours of darkness. And so, each evening brought a ritual performed not with ceremony, but with the solemn precision of those who knew that failure meant frostbite, illness, or worse. Banking the fire was not simply a task. It was survival distilled to embers. The act itself looked simple enough. Glowing coals were pushed into a compact cluster, nestled close like newborns in a cradle. Then carefully, ash was mounded on top. Not too much, lest the fire smother, and not too little, or the cold air would steal the heat away before dawn. It was a dance of instinct and hope, like balancing a fragile spark on hope's edge. They didn't have thermometers or timers, just fingers that could feel warmth through soot and years of passed-down wisdom. In those moments, the hearth was treated with reverence. The mother's hands would move slowly, tenderly, tucking the fire in as one might a fevered child. She would listen to the faint crackle beneath the ash, straining for that tiny, persistent hiss of life. A good bank would glow faintly through the night, ready to rise again with the first breath of morning. A poor bank meant blackened ash and the long, cold work of starting over, if they could. The danger never truly slept. Wind could slip through a broken shutter and whisper death across the coals. A curious pig or restless dog might stumble too close and scatter the delicate pile. Sometimes even a careless turn in sleep, too near the hearth, could send sparks tumbling in directions they shouldn't go. Fire was both ally and adversary. Too little, and it vanished. Too much, and it devoured. So, families watched. Long after the hut had grown quiet, someone would stir, rise stiffly from straw and cloth, and tiptoe to the hearth. A hand would hover over the mound of ash, gauging the hidden heat. Was it still warm? Did it need adjusting? Children sometimes took these shifts, learning from a young age that warmth was not guaranteed. It had to be earned and protected. They didn't guard the fire because it was precious. They guarded it because it was everything. In the middle of an unforgiving winter, with no central heating or extra blankets, a handful of buried embers was the thread tying life to the coming dawn. When morning finally arrived and the ash was gently brushed aside, finding even a faint glow was a quiet triumph. A few dry twigs placed carefully, a soft exhale to coax the spark into breath. Then, if all went well, a tiny flame. Not a blaze, not yet, but enough to boil water, warm fingers, and remind them that once again, they had made it through. This nightly battle with fire was never fought alone. Each family leaned on one another, sharing shifts, warmth, and the burden of hope. And so, as the embers slumbered beneath their snowy blanket, the rest of the family gathered tight in the hut's warmest corner, preparing for the next battle in silence and togetherness. Now, with the hearth banked and darkness thick around them, they turned to yet another weapon in their quiet war against the cold, the power of communal sleep. When the cold pressed in from every direction, and the fire lay buried beneath ash, there was only one defense left: each other. Night after night, in huts stitched from hope and hay, families became a tapestry of tangled limbs and shared breath. It wasn't elegance that saved them, it was proximity. There were no bedrooms, no quilts for each child, no distance to preserve modesty. Instead, the floor, layered with straw, perhaps a worn blanket or two, became the great equalizer. Infants, parents, grandparents, and the occasional neighbor or orphaned cousin lay side by side in a single human knot. The eldest were often closest to the fire pit, where the warmth might help their aching joints. The youngest were swaddled and tucked deep in the middle, protected by layers of human care. Strong adults, those who rose early and bore the burdens of labor, often took the edges. They served as walls against the creeping cold, their own limbs growing numb so the fragile bodies within could rest. This arrangement was instinctual, shaped by necessity, not instruction. No one had to explain why a shivering toddler belonged between two broad backs. It was simply known. There was no room for bashfulness in a winter like this. Elbows dug into ribs, feet searched for warmth in the folds of someone else's tunic. Every breath fogged into the cold air, then disappeared into the dark. And still somehow they found comfort. They whispered stories, the same ones told for generations, their voices muffled by wool and sleep. They sang quiet songs, lullabies laced with resilience, melodies meant less for beauty and more for unity. Laughter sometimes bloomed even in the thick of discomfort. A child would snore, someone would mutter a sleepy protest, an older sibling would pretend to be a bear, growling until the smallest ones giggled. These were not grand moments, but they were tender, and they mattered. It wasn't just about heat, it was about being known, being present, and reminding one another, even in the dark, we are still here. In those close quarters, love wasn't poetic, it was practical. A shared breath could warm a cheek, a sturdy arm could keep the cold from settling into a fragile chest. In the medieval night, togetherness was not a luxury, it was a tool of survival. And though they clung to one another in desperation, there was a strange sort of peace in that pile of people. No one was alone. The bitter wind might batter the hut's walls, and the world outside might freeze solid. But inside, there was life, movement, heartbeats. Yet the peasants were not the only ones who lay down together to ward off the chill. Survival demanded more than human warmth. Their allies, surprisingly soft and sturdy, breathed in the dark just a few feet away. With their own kind of heat and quiet companionship, the livestock had their part to play too. And so, beyond the tangled limbs and tired sighs of the huddled family, other bodies shifted in the gloom, feathered, woolly, and patient, ready to share in the night's quiet burden. It might sound absurd to modern ears, inviting your cows and chickens to spend the night inside your home. But to a medieval peasant, it was simple logic. When the cold threatened to squeeze every last ounce of warmth from the night, you turned to whatever source of heat you had. And few things radiated warmth, quite like a living furnace of fur and feathers. The family cow, large and patient, was often stationed closest to the people, her breath steaming in the frigid air, her broadsides radiating a deep, comforting heat. Chickens nestled in corners, feathers fluffed, beady eyes blinking slowly as they drifted into sleep. If there was a pig, and many households kept one, it might snore contentedly under a bench or stretch out in a pile of straw near the door. Each animal was more than livestock now. It was insulation. The hut, already a snug space, quickly transformed into a chaotic patchwork of species. Children crawled over goats to reach their sleeping spots. Dogs wormed their way under legs. Occasionally, a cloven hoof would land squarely on a sleeping uncle's foot, earning a groan and a sleepy muttering of curses. Chickens clucked and rustled at odd hours. Cows shifted with a sigh that sounded remarkably human. The symphony of the medieval winter night was anything but silent. And the smell, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly a field of lavender. The mingled aromas of wet wool, hay, smoke, and manure created a fragrance that could politely be called memorable. But no one complained. Not seriously. Because in the arithmetic of survival, the warmth of one cow could mean the difference between waking up with stiff fingers or not waking up at all. Each animal added degrees to the fragile bubble of warmth within the hut. A cow could heat a small room just by existing. A pig, warm-blooded and fat, was a walking hot water bottle. Chickens radiated less heat, but huddled together in numbers. Even they contributed. It became a game of numbers, more creatures, fewer frozen toes. It wasn't cozy, it wasn't clean, but it was necessary. And over time it became a part of the rhythm of winter life. Children learned to step carefully around sleeping beasts. Grandmothers muttered soft lullabies to drowsy chickens. Fathers repaired fences during the day and whispered to the oxen by firelight. A strange companionship grew in those dim, smoky rooms. Not affection, exactly, but a mutual endurance. There was something quietly humbling about it all. In the bitterest part of the year, survival blurred the lines between man and beast. Everyone huddled for warmth. Everyone waited for spring. And when a pig shifted in the dark, pressing a warm side against a cold foot, it wasn't just tolerated, it was a blessing. Of course, warmth didn't rely solely on borrowed body heat. Human beings had other tricks up their sleeves, or rather, on their sleeves. In the absence of central heating or fleece-lined parkas, peasants turned to the oldest defense of all, clothing. Thick, layered, scratchy, and sometimes absurd, their garments were the next great barrier between skin and frost. And so, with cows by their side and wool on their backs, they braced themselves for the cold's next assault. When the frost bit hard and the wind tore through even the thickest hut walls, medieval peasants turned to the one defense still under their control: clothing. Not the tailored, stylish, seasonal sort. This was survival wear. Think less runway and more run for your life. Picture human haystacks bundled in wool, barely recognizable under piles of fabric stitched, patched, and layered until movement itself became a challenge. They wore everything, all at once. Rough wool tunics rubbed against sagging leggings, tied at the knees with strips of cloth that had been repurposed from who knows what. Oversized cloaks, often too heavy to hang properly, draped over sloping shoulders like wet canvas. Mittens were rare, but sleeves were long enough to hide hands inside them. Scarves and hoods, if available, were treasured, used more for trapping warmth than making any kind of fashion statement. The idea was simple: trap body heat and don't let it escape. And since medieval wool was anything but refined, the scratchy, heavy fabric had a brutal kind of efficiency. Peasants didn't concern themselves with comfort or elegance. If a layer didn't itch, it probably wasn't doing its job. As for washing clothes during the winter, forget it. Imagine trying to dip garments into a stream, only to find it crusted with ice, a betrayal from nature that turned daily tasks into impossible feats. Laundry in winter was both rare and reckless. Wet wool took forever to dry, and froze solid if left outside. So, peasants adapted. They simply didn't wash much at all. What began as a compromise became an unlikely advantage. Over time, The dirt and body grease accumulated in the fabric, creating a grimy kind of insulation. It was gritty, yes, but it worked. The grease helped repel moisture, and the layers grew stiff and wind-resistant in ways the weaver never intended. Clothes that had long since lost their original color or shape became like armor, ugly, pungent, but fiercely protective. Children wore hand-me-downs of hand-me-downs, sleeves too long and hems dragging in the mud. Adults patched their garments endlessly, stitching new scraps onto old, creating a kind of living history in cloth. Every hole told a story. Every patch meant survival. Fashion trends were not only irrelevant, they were completely alien. No one cared what you looked like. Staying warm was the only status symbol that mattered. And then there were the feet. Few had actual shoes in winter, especially the poorest. Instead, they wrapped their feet in rags or scraps of wool, binding them tightly with cord or twine. Sometimes, if lucky, they'd have wooden clogs to keep them off the snow, though even these cracked with use and froze overnight. By day, these human haystacks trudged through frost-covered fields and icy paths. By night, they peeled off what they could without sacrificing heat, leaving their stiff outer garments near the fire, if there was one, and crawling under shared blankets still wrapped in their softest layers. They had one final trick up their sleeve, or under it rather. Dirt. Not the dirt they tried to brush off, but the dirt they embraced. Used strategically, it played a surprising role in their winter survival, and that's where our next chapter begins. When warmth was life and luxury a distant dream, medieval peasants found protection in the most unexpected ally: dirt. To modern minds, the idea of clinging to filth as a survival strategy might trigger a shudder. But in the unforgiving cold of a medieval winter, grime wasn't just a byproduct of hardship, it was a deliberate, gritty form of resilience. What began as neglect became ingenuity, and in time, a crust of stubborn warmth formed where hygiene might once have reigned. Clothing, rarely washed in the colder months, grew thick with a blend of body oils, smoke, dust, and earth. Over time, this mixture clogged the tiny gaps in woven wool and coarse linen, sealing them like a makeshift windbreaker. It was nature's version of thermal insulation. The wind might rage outside, but it struggled to sneak through sleeves that were practically sealed shut with months of wear and accumulated grit. Think of it as natural armor against the wind, a crude, effective barrier forged not in workshops, but in wood smoke and sweat. Mud was also no stranger to the daily routine. It clung to the hems of cloaks and tunics, drying into stiff crusts that added weight, but also warmth. Children playing or working in muck tracked it indoors, unintentionally reinforcing their garments with layers of baked earth. Clothes hardened over time, forming odd protective shells around their wearers. Beneath these, body heat stayed closer, locked in by filth that no washboard would dare touch until spring. The result? A peasant might reek, but they wouldn't freeze. And that was the only metric that mattered. In a world without deodorant, scented soaps, or expectations of regular bathing, there was no shame in stench. Everyone stank, and no one was offended. Smell was simply a fact of life, like the rising sun or the next poor harvest. To scrub yourself clean in winter was to strip away a carefully built layer of defense. In that context, dirt was no longer a sign of laziness or defeat. It was a sign of determination, a protective crust that had earned its place. What outsiders might view as filth, peasants understood as function. There was even a quiet dignity in this acceptance. Maintaining this crust of stubborn warmth took discipline in its own strange way. You didn't waste heat or water chasing an ideal of cleanliness that could kill you. You focused on survival, and that meant letting go of vanity in favor of wisdom born from generations of trial and error. This grime-bound existence extended beyond clothes and skin. Dirt crept into every part of their world, into their meals, their bedding, and their bones. And yet, they lived. Not in comfort, perhaps, but in defiance. Their lives were etched in soot and mud, and still, they endured. And when the long day ended, when fingers stiffened and boots cracked, they returned to their homes not to plush beds or warm linens, but to nests. Nests of straw and burlap and whatever scraps could be found. These beds too held stories of makeshift rest and stolen moments of warmth. It is there, in the humble cradles of sleep, that we now turn. Imagine ending a day of bitter cold and endless toil by sinking, not into the embrace of a feather mattress or memory foam, but into a brittle nest of broken promises. That was the medieval straw bed. To call it a mattress was generous. It was more a pile of hope, hastily bundled straw or rushes spread across the frozen dirt floor in the desperate pursuit of rest. And yet, in those harsh winters, it was all they had. Straw, by its very nature, wasn't built for comfort. It started firm, poking and shifting with every movement. Over days it flattened beneath the weight of weary bodies, turning from prickly padding into a thin, lumpy mat that barely softened the hard ground. It didn't hold its shape, didn't spring back, just slowly collapsed into something that whispered of warmth but rarely delivered. Sleep, when it came, was hard-won and often fleeting. Then came the mold, the dampness that crept up from the floor below and drifted down from the breath above, soaked into the bedding, turning golden straw a sickly gray. And where dampness lingered, pests followed. Fleas, lice, and other unwelcome bedfellows burrowed into the makeshift nests, thriving in the shared body heat of closely huddled families. A single restless night could be interrupted, not just by cold or coughs, but by the insistent itch of a dozen tiny invaders. In some homes, rushes were used instead, thicker, flatter reeds that offered slightly more durability. Herbs like lavender or rosemary were occasionally mixed in, not for romance or luxury, but to battle the ever-present stench. Their sharp, earthy scent masked the odors of sweat, animals, and damp decay. It was a modest rebellion against the gloom, a small grace carved from nature's pharmacy. Despite their many failings, these humble beds played an important role. They were a barrier, however thin, between the peasant and the unforgiving earth. Packed thick enough, the straw added just enough insulation to trap body heat and keep the frozen floor from leaching warmth during the long night. A blanket was often nothing more than a tattered cloak, and so the mattress, pitiful as it was, mattered more than it appeared. The reality of rest in a peasant's life wasn't about relaxation, it was about preservation. You didn't lie down to recover. You collapsed to survive. And still somehow comfort was found, not in softness or support, but in the presence of others, in the shared burden of fatigue, and in the knowledge that morning meant another day lived. But warmth was not won by bedding alone. The battle against winter crept in from all directions, through the walls, the floors, and most insidiously, through the cracks and crevices that laced the hut like wounds. So, once the fire was banked, the animals nestled, and the straw settled, another nightly ritual began, sealing the home against the drafts that whispered through the night like ghosts. And so, we follow the wind to the walls, where the next defense was mounted. The medieval peasant's home was a sieve for winter's cruelty. Walls meant to offer shelter betrayed their occupants daily, and the wind, slippery and sly, slipped through every crack like a thief in the night. It prowled along the floorboards, curled around ankles, and licked at faces like a mischievous spirit, never invited but always present. No corner of the hut was safe from its reach, and so began a nightly ritual of resistance, small acts of ingenuity born of desperation and grit. First came the seams, gaps between daubed timbers where the mud had dried and pulled away. These were stuffed with anything that could be spared, tufts of moss gathered from the woods, rags too tattered even for layering, and handfuls of straw mashed into place with frozen fingers. There was no illusion of perfection, only the hope that each plug would slow the wind for another hour. Children helped too, their small hands pushing moss into narrow spaces, turning draft stopping into a family endeavor. Next was the daub itself. Over time, the original coating of mud, dung, and straw crumbled, leaving hollows for winter to crawl through. Fresh layers were added with whatever could be scraped from the earth: wet clay, old ash, even the remnants of dung cakes. Mixed and slapped into place, it was applied like plaster from 1,000 years ago. It froze quickly, often before it could fully seal, but even a partial barrier was better than none. The roofs presented their own betrayals. Thatch, dry and brittle after seasons of sun and storm, sagged under the weight of snow and let the cold drip down like a slow leak from the sky. Without new straw to rethatch, families patched what they could. Cloth scraps, once shirts or sacks, were nailed or tied between beams. Turf blocks, cut from nearby fields, were wedged into holes. The result was no grand fix, but a patchwork of survival, damp, mismatched, and miraculous. This wasn't a one-time repair job. It was a relentless, ongoing battle. Every gust of wind revealed a new weakness. Every drop of water found a new path inside. But each night they patched again. They didn't expect to win against the cold. They simply refused to lose. Determination was the mortar that held those fragile walls together. And still, the wind would return, persistent and cruel. But so would the peasants, armed with their scraps and their stubbornness. Their homes were not strong by design, but by will. Every stuffed crack, every muddy smear was a declaration. We are not finished yet. Yet even the most tightly patched hut could not hold warmth for long. Cold seeped in through the ground, down from the rafters, and through the thin skin of patched walls. And so warmth became a shared task, guarded in the hearth, multiplied through bodies, and preserved in rotation. As night deepened and frost crept up the walls, families turned to one more tactic in their long war with winter: sleeping in shifts. Not everyone could afford to drift into full slumber. Someone needed to be near the fire, someone to stir the embers, someone to watch the wind's whispering hands for signs of trouble. And so they lay, half asleep and half alert, guarding each other through the darkest hours, because survival wasn't just about enduring cold. It was about refusing to face it alone. Sleep, in the medieval winter, was not a luxury. It was a negotiation. While the outside world froze into silence, inside the fragile huts of peasant families, rest came in fragments, parceled out like scarce rations. True sleep was sacrificed in favor of survival. And so emerged a ritual of rotation, a weary dance around the hearth that stretched through the long, unforgiving nights. The fire was the center of this choreography. It did not sleep, and so neither could they. Not all at once. Embers had to be watched, coaxed, protected. The smallest draft could kill them. A careless moment could turn warmth to ash. And so, families organized themselves into quiet shifts. Someone would always be up, eyes half-lidded, body wrapped in whatever warmth they could find, tending the flames with practiced care. It was a rhythm born not of strategy, but of necessity. Mothers would take the early hours, cradling infants close while feeding the fire with bits of dried rushes or twigs. Older children, barely old enough to stay awake, were taught to stir the coals gently, to lay new fuel without disturbing the precious glow beneath. Fathers might rise in the deepest dark, dragging themselves from brittle straw beds to crouch near the hearth and whisper reassurances to the glowing heart of their home. No one truly rested. Even those curled in makeshift nests of rags and hay slept with one ear open, for the cry of a restless cow, the flutter of disturbed chickens, or the telltale hiss of wind finding a crack. The air inside was rarely silent. A snort from a goat, the rattle of a draft, the occasional cough from a smoke-clogged chest, all these were the lullabies of a winter night. The lack of rest took its toll. Bodies ached from cold and stiffness, eyes burned with fatigue, tempers frayed in the dark. Yet the system endured. It worked. The embers lived. And in their survival, so did the family. The dance was not without grace. It fostered a strange kind of intimacy, a quiet unity forged in hardship. One child would slip into a sibling's place beside the fire without words. A parent would wordlessly pass a warm stone to their partner, freshly heated from the flames. It was a cycle of care, passed from hand to hand, hour to hour. Through this shared sacrifice, they kept the night at bay. The cold was vast and the dark endless, but their small flame remained alive because they remained awake, alert, and together. Even in exhaustion, they found strength in one another. And as dawn crept over frozen fields and light filtered weakly through thatched roofs, the hearth still glowed, a flickering testament to the power of shared effort. But warmth was not just in the fire. It was also in the breath, the slow, deliberate rhythm of inhaling and exhaling, of conserving what little heat the body could make. In a world where even air could betray, breathing itself became a survival strategy. In the ruthless chill of medieval winters, even the simple act of breathing was a matter of survival. Each inhalation carried with it the threat of pain, icy air rushing into lungs like cold knives, stealing warmth from the body's core. So families adapted. They learned to sip the air slowly, deliberately, as if each breath were a ladle of precious broth being rationed at a feast they could barely afford. This wasn't exaggeration. It was expertise born of necessity. Deep breaths, while natural in warmer months, were dangerous in the dead of winter. A single careless gulp of frigid air could lead to a brutal cough, or worse, the dreaded descent into pneumonia. In a world with no antibiotics, no cozy clinics, and no heated sickbeds, a chest infection could easily end in a burial mound. So they breathed like foxes hiding in snow, shallow, measured, and quiet. Through the nose, not the mouth, always. And when the air outside was cruelest, they covered their faces with anything they could spare. Scraps of wool, a fold of a tunic, or a tattered scarf passed from hand to hand. These makeshift masks grew damp quickly, wet from breath, touched by frost. But still, they worked. They were barriers between life and a lungful of ice. Children learned early. Just as they were taught to keep coals alive and to tuck straw into gaps in the wall, they were also taught how to breathe. Mothers would gently remind their little ones, holding a cloth over tiny noses, whispering, "Soft, like you're smelling soup, not blowing out candles." It became second nature, a skill not written in books, but etched into memory through the sheer cold of repetition. Nighttime was the trickiest. While sleep tempted the body to slow and deepen its rhythm, winter punished that instinct. So people trained themselves to breathe lightly, even in dreams. The body adapted over time. The chest learned not to rise too far. Nostrils flared only slightly. Muscles stayed tense but practiced. Survival was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, controlled, and very, very small. There was humor in it too, dark and dry. Someone might grumble that they weren't even allowed the luxury of a good sigh without risking their lungs, or tease a neighbor who snored too loudly with warnings of breathing like you're trying to swallow the moon. Even amid hardship, laughter remained a layer of insulation. The breath was not merely a function. It was a discipline, a craft, passed from frozen mouth to frozen mouth. Families who had survived many winters knew the rhythm instinctively, shallow in the morning, slower in the night, never wasteful. Even a good yawn could be postponed until one was sure it was safe to take it by the fire. And so, with practiced lungs and covered faces, the peasants endured. They sipped air like the precious warmth it was, conserving every wisp of heat their bodies generated. In a world where the cold clawed at every opening, they guarded even their breath. Still, no breath could truly warm a starving belly. Even the most cautious inhalation couldn't fight the kind of cold that starts from within. And so, the next vital battle for winter survival moved to the hearth and the pot, where food or the hope of it might offer warmth from the inside out. In the harsh grip of winter, warmth didn't just come from fires and blankets, it came from within. A full belly could mean the difference between shivering through the night or drifting into a warm, exhausted sleep. A good meal was more than comfort. It was kindling for the body, a furnace in the belly that burned long into the freezing hours. Peasant families learned long ago that what they ate mattered just as much as how they dressed or how tightly they sealed their homes. The meals weren't fancy, but they were chosen with care. Thick stews bubbled slowly over smoky hearths, made from whatever scraps the season allowed. Tough root vegetables, dried peas, a handful of barley, and maybe, on a lucky day, a sliver of salted meat. It wasn't flavor they chased, but fuel. Porridge was a daily staple, often eaten for both breakfast and supper. Made from oats or whatever grain they could get their hands on, it stuck to the ribs and lingered in the stomach. Into it, they'd stir whatever was on hand. Herbs, lard, even blood from livestock if meat was scarce. It was warm, filling, and slow to digest, exactly what the cold demanded. Fat was the crown jewel of winter eating. It burned slowly, feeding the inner fire long after the last spoonful was swallowed. Whether from animal drippings, a rare bit of pork, or a smear of preserved butter, it was added to meals whenever possible. It gave the body something solid to work with, energy not just for movement, but for warmth. Parents understood this instinctively. Even the fussiest child would be coaxed into eating, no matter the taste or texture. "Eat, or the cold will eat you," they'd say, sometimes gently, sometimes with firm resolve. There was no room for pickiness in winter. Hunger wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. An empty stomach couldn't fight the frost. Meals were moments of quiet victory. The family would gather near the fire, bowls in hand, steam rising into the air as their bodies relaxed just a little. The first bite sent a wave of heat through cold, chapped lips. The last brought a heaviness to the limbs, a signal that the body was ready to rest, to restore. But keeping food warm in such cold conditions was another challenge. Fires couldn't burn all day, and reheating took precious fuel. That's where ingenuity stepped in. Many families used hay boxes, insulated baskets or crates lined with hay, where a hot pot could be tucked after a brief cook over the fire. The trapped heat would continue to slow cook the meal for hours, saving energy and delivering warmth at mealtime. Another trick: heated stones. Pulled from the fire and wrapped in cloth, they were placed near bowls or tucked beside the stew pot, radiating warmth just long enough to keep food from chilling before it reached the mouth. Some even kept one stone for the table and another for their feet. Through clever thinking and hearty meals, peasants managed to hold warmth close, one spoonful at a time. But their creativity didn't stop at the kitchen. As winter deepened, so did their reliance on unconventional tools and techniques, like finding ways to warm the body without fire at all. In a world where every scrap of fuel was precious and every ember hard-earned, peasants could not afford the luxury of letting a fire burn unchecked just to keep food hot. That necessity gave rise to a stroke of quiet genius: the haybox. Imagine a sturdy wooden chest or crate, its inside lined with layers of soft, insulating hay. Into this nest, a steaming pot fresh from the hearth was placed, lid sealed tight. The hay embraced the pot like a wooden cocoon for warmth, trapping the heat and allowing the food to continue cooking slowly for hours without a single extra stick of firewood. The hay box was not just practical, it was almost magical to those who relied on it. Morning stews could be started with a brief, roaring boil, then set into the hay box to finish gently while the family went about the day's work. By evening, the pot would still be warm, the flavors richer, the ingredients tender. In the bitter heart of winter, when daylight was short and the wind cut like a blade, lifting the lid to find hot food inside felt like discovering a small miracle. But food wasn't the only thing peasants learned to keep warm. The same principles of heat retention were applied in an even more personal way, with heated stones. Smooth, dense rocks were placed directly into the heart of the fire until they glowed with a deep, invisible heat. Then, using thick cloth or layers of wool, they were carefully wrapped and tucked into beds before the family lay down for the night. The stones radiated their stored warmth for hours, transforming freezing pallets into something almost cozy. Sometimes, one or two stones were kept near the feet, driving away the biting cold that crept up from the frozen ground. Others were nestled between sleeping bodies, their heat mingling with the shared warmth of human closeness. In homes where animals shared the space, a stone might even be placed near a calf or chicken to keep them alive through the night. Of course, such simple technology came with dangers. A stone fresh from the flames could burn flesh, or set smoldering straw alight if handled carelessly. Children had to be warned, and accidents still happened. Scorched bedding, singed fingers, even the occasional small fire. There was also the risk of stones cracking or exploding if heated too quickly, sending shards across the hearth. Caution was as much a part of the process as the warmth itself. Despite these risks, the benefits far outweighed the dangers. In homes where nights dropped far below freezing, these heated stones could mean the difference between waking stiff and aching or waking with the strength to face another day. They were, in a sense, the silent guardians of the night, holding on to the sun's borrowed heat long after the flames had died. Together, the haybox and the heated stone embodied the ingenuity of survival in a world with no modern conveniences. They were proof that great innovation didn't always come from grand inventions. Sometimes it was as humble as a box of hay or a rock from the ground. In their quiet way, these tools gave peasants the ability to stretch the warmth of their fires far beyond their natural limits. And yet, even with these clever aids, there was no denying that the hearth remained the heart of winter life. For the ultimate warmth, both physical and emotional, families still looked to the glow of their fire. And so, the most strategic sleepers made sure their beds were closest to that precious source of heat. When winter bit the hardest and the night grew long, the hearth wasn't just a fireplace. It was a circle of precious warmth, a lifeline wrapped in flickering orange glow. Every inch around it became prime real estate in the tactical game of survival, and sleeping arrangements weren't left to chance. They were carefully, even instinctively, orchestrated to maximize both safety and heat. Infants and elders, those most vulnerable to the cold, were always positioned closest to the fire. They lay nestled in the warmth like treasures in a fragile vault, their bodies wrapped in layers of patched wool and animal skins. Their caregivers hovered nearby, ready to shift them away if the flames flared too high or a coal popped loose. But getting too close to the hearth came with its own risks. Sparks could leap from the embers, blankets could catch, and a restless sleeper might accidentally brush against the hot stones edging the fire. The trick was to find that sweet spot, close enough to feel the heat, far enough to avoid waking with singed hair or blistered skin. It was a delicate equation that changed constantly with the weather, the size of the fire, and the number of people sharing the space. The heat never spread evenly. Those closest to the flames sometimes found themselves sweating through layers, while others at the fringes shivered under piles of blankets. It wasn't uncommon for someone on the edge to scoot closer in the night, triggering a domino effect of shifting bodies and grumbled protests. And then, there were the animals. Dogs and cats, goats, even the occasional chicken, all instinctively drawn to warmth, often muscled into hearthside spots of their own. A dog might worm its way between a toddler and a grandparent, tail thumping in the ashes. A goat might settle near someone's feet, radiating heat, but also threatening a rude awakening if it rolled over. This chaos was not just tolerated, but accepted, because every warm body counted. Whether two-legged or four, if it helped fend off the cold, it was welcomed into the ring. There were no separate bedrooms, no quiet sanctuaries. Survival in winter meant embracing togetherness in all its messy, cramped, wonderfully human forms. Sometimes families added makeshift partitions or used furniture to create windbreaks around the hearth, turning the space into a thermal nest. Blankets or cloaks were hung up behind sleepers to block drafts, and people tucked in shoulder to shoulder like pieces in a puzzle. Each person part of the whole, each breath adding to the warmth. It was this deeply communal approach, not just within homes but eventually between them, that allowed villages to endure the longest, darkest months. Even in a world of endless scarcity, peasants found ways to pool their warmth, their resources, and their resilience. Because when one fire struggled to burn, another might be stronger. And sometimes, survival wasn't just about where you slept, but who you shared the fire with. From the glowing heart of the hearth, the circle widened, out toward neighbors, toward community, and toward the shared will to endure whatever the cold had left to give. In the depths of winter, survival was never a solo act. Beyond the fragile walls of individual huts, the village itself became a web of shared survival, a delicate yet determined network of people bound not just by blood or duty, but by the common understanding that no one got through the cold alone. This network hummed quietly, almost invisibly, under the surface of daily hardship. Paths worn into the snow connected homes like lifelines, and footprints pressed into frozen mud told stories of neighborly check-ins and urgent errands. The sharpest eyes in the village, often elders too frail for heavy labor, became guardians of the frost, watching for chimney smoke or its absence. A dark hearth meant danger. It meant someone might be in trouble, and trouble in winter could turn fatal quickly. When a home went quiet, these silent sentinels raised the alarm. Others responded without hesitation, trudging through snowdrifts to knock, to offer coals, broth, or even a warm place by their own fire. In these moments, survival instincts gave way to something deeper, a communal code etched into the soul of every villager. They shared what they could, no matter how little. Coals were carried between homes in covered pots or swaddled in ash, cradled like newborns. A bowl of porridge, stretched with root vegetables or yesterday's scraps, might be offered to a sick neighbor before it fed a family's own child. Blankets were patched together from bits of old garments, stitched not for beauty, but for warmth, then passed from one hut to another as need demanded. Even the oldest grudges, arguments over land, livestock, or family slights, were quietly tucked away for the season. Winter had a way of humbling everyone. When the snow fell thick and the wind howled through every crack, no one cared who had insulted whose fence post the spring before. The cold made peace a necessity. Children, too, played their part. They became swift runners and eager helpers, ferrying news, food, or kindling across the village with mittens soaked through and cheeks red from the chill. Their light steps carried hope with them, a reminder that even in the bleakest times, life marched stubbornly on. At night, when the wind screamed and the doors shook in their frames, people found comfort in knowing others nearby were enduring the same. If you listened closely, you might hear faint songs rising from another hut, or a mother's lullaby carried faintly on the breeze, a human echo through the frost. And in this way, the village endured. It wasn't always graceful, and certainly not always easy, but it was real, tangible, gritty, and fiercely human. Every ember shared, every story whispered, every knock at a neighbor's door became another stitch in the patchwork of collective survival. Each small act, though often unseen by the wider world, carried within it the weight of centuries of human resilience. As the cold wore on and the nights stretched longer, something else quietly burned just as fiercely as the hearths inside every home: faith. In each other, in the return of spring, and in forces greater than themselves. And it is to that quiet, unwavering faith that we now turn, the last ember glowing in the darkness. When firewood ran low and the night winds howled through every crack, faith became the final refuge, a shelter no frost could breach. In the heart of each peasant home, long after stories faded and songs went silent, prayer rose softly into the cold air, a whispered shield against the cold. Before sleep, families gathered close, heads bowed, hands clasped, breath forming tiny clouds in the icy room. Their prayers weren't grand or poetic, but they were fierce with need, not just for warmth, but for strength, for tomorrow, for mercy. Children recited simple lines taught by trembling grandmothers. Fathers murmured old blessings passed down through generations. They prayed to saints who had become more than spiritual figures. They were companions in hardship. Where once a peasant might have asked Saint Isidore to bless the harvest, now he turned to Saint Cuthbert, believed to warm lost travelers, or Saint Brigid, whose cloak was said to protect against bitter wind. These weren't abstract devotions. They were pleas for survival whispered in the dark. Superstition intertwined with faith in ways no priest could unravel. Holy water was sprinkled near hearths to ward off evil, and chalk crosses were drawn on doors during Epiphany to guard against spirits slipping in with the wind. A bit of bread left on the sill wasn't just charity for the hungry, it was an offering for protection, a humble bargain struck with forces unseen. These rituals gave structure to uncertainty. In a world where the next morning was never guaranteed, hope wasn't a luxury. It was a survival tool. Just as moss filled gaps in the wall and dirt trapped warmth in clothes, belief filled the hollow spaces that fear carved out. It offered something beyond reason, the sense that someone, something, was watching, caring, guiding. Faith also bridged the silence when words failed. When the fire had nearly died and frost clung to lashes, a mother's humming of a hymn could feel like the first sign of dawn. A cross made on a child's forehead before sleep became an invisible armor against the night. These moments didn't make the cold vanish, but they made it bearable. There were no miracles, no divine windbreaks or heavenly warmth. But there was endurance, and that was miracle enough. Even those who grumbled at the church or feared the priest's power often found themselves whispering to the Virgin Mary in the loneliest hours of night. Because when the roof leaked and the coals dimmed, what else was there to hold on to but the quiet hope that winter too would pass? But faith could only shield the soul, not the body. And for all their prayers, for all the chalked doors and whispered saints' names, the cold still claimed its price. Now, we turn to the toll, the quiet reckoning, the spaces left empty come spring. Not every fire survived the night. Not every door opened again in spring. Winter, for all its quiet beauty, was a merciless predator, a creeping force that didn't roar, but whispered, waited, and wore people down. It came not just with ice and wind, but with a kind of silence that filled the corners of a hut when even hope had grown cold. It was a frost that stole breath, gently at first, then all at once. The toll was real. Homes would stand with smokeless chimneys, their hearths gone dark. Inside, sometimes a whole family lay still, wrapped in each other's arms, as if they'd simply drifted off and forgot to wake up. Roofs collapsed under the weight of snow. Walls buckled when thaw turned them to mud. These weren't rare tragedies. In the hardest years, they were common knowledge. No year etched this truth deeper than 1315, the beginning of what would be remembered as the Great Famine. Rain fell for months, crops drowned in their own fields, and winter, already brutal, turned ravenous. It was no longer just the cold that killed, but the hunger that clawed beneath it. People ate bark, roots, and sometimes things better left unspoken. That winter didn't just kill, it devoured hope. Disease rode in on frostbitten toes and breathless coughs. With bodies weakened by hunger and cold, even a simple fever could become a sentence. Frostbite crept up unnoticed until fingers blackened, until walking became crawling. It was a season of silence punctuated by coughs, cries, and eventually nothing at all. And yet, there was no panic, no wailing, just the slow, grim nod of a people who had lived too long with death to be surprised by it. In the medieval village, loss was never a stranger. It was a neighbor, one you didn't welcome, but also didn't fear. Children learned early not to ask why someone didn't come back from the woods. They simply learned to keep the fire burning a little longer the next night. Grief carved its place into the rhythm of life, and still the rhythm went on. There were fields to tend, roofs to patch, babies to swaddle. Even as one hand buried the dead, the other planted seeds for spring. Because spring always came. Late, maybe, but it came. And for those who endured, even loss couldn't erase the quiet triumph of survival. Peasants didn't write histories. Their stories weren't carved into stone, but they endured winters that would break the bones of kings, survived in homes made of sticks and mud, in clothes stiff with grease and dirt, warmed by faith, fire, and each other. And that endurance, that unrecorded, unwitnessed strength, became their legacy, because winter always came to the village, and the villagers always stood to meet it. Now we turn to that legacy, not of nobles or knights, but of those who endured quietly, and what they left behind for us. They left no monuments, no ballads carried their names across time. And yet the medieval peasants, those quiet architects of survival, stitched themselves into history's fabric, thread by thread, with hay, fire, and stubborn will. Their lives were not easy, not noble in the romantic sense. But every moss-stuffed wall, every banked ember, every communal breath shared on a frozen night, these were acts of defiance, small ones, daily ones, but powerful nonetheless. They didn't have much, and what they did have was often cracked, leaking, and cold, but they made it work, over and over again. There is something sacred in that kind of ingenuity, something enduring in the way they turned dung and mud into shelter, straw into warmth, and togetherness into armor. In a world that offered them little, they responded with invention. Their tools were improvised, but their spirits were precise, adapted to the world, shaped by hardship, but never conquered. They didn't fight wars for crowns. They fought for each sunrise, each warm meal, each flicker of flame that meant another hour, another chance. And in doing so, they passed down more than just survival tactics. They handed us lessons we still live by, even if we've forgotten where they came from. Adaptation in the face of scarcity, unity when there's barely enough for one, hope, not as a feeling, but as a practice, daily, deliberate, essential. We may live in insulated homes now, our beds soft, our meals hot by command. But every blanket, every glowing hearth, every moment of comfort we take for granted was planted like a seed by those who came before. They endured, so we wouldn't have to quite as much. Their fingerprints are on our walls, our kitchens, our stories, even if we can't see them. Their legacy isn't grand. It's granular. A pile of moss in a wall crack, a sleeping child pressed close to a sibling, a fire kept alive through the dark, and yet from these small acts came something monumental, a lineage of resilience, a quiet inheritance of grit. And maybe that's the truest mark of heroism, not being remembered, but being built upon. Because before there were castles and courts and queens, there were peasants who bent their backs and refused to freeze. Their story is not just a footnote in history, it's the foundation. And now, as we turn from their huts of straw and smoke, we step into the flickering light of a different kind of survival, not from winter's hunger, but from ambition's fire. Next, we meet a woman born far from thrones, who reached for one anyway. Anne Boleyn's story begins not in frost, but in flame. Long before the crown, before the courtship and calamity, Anne Boleyn was simply a spark in a quiet noble house, small, bright, and bound to catch fire. She was born around 1501, likely at Blickling Hall in Norfolk, into a family whose status hung just shy of prominence. The Boleyns weren't royal, but they were climbing, steadily and with purpose. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was a man of ambition stitched into his very name. Skilled in languages and diplomacy, Thomas saw court favor not as a blessing, but as a ladder, and he intended his children to climb it. Her mother, Elizabeth Howard, gave Anne her noble bloodline and a family name better known at court. Through Elizabeth, Anne carried the legacy of the powerful Howard family, aristocratic in standing and sharp in politics. Together, Thomas and Elizabeth were not merely raising children, they were shaping strategic assets for a Tudor world. Anne was not her family's only hope, but she would become their boldest. From a young age, she exhibited traits that made her stand out: a keen intelligence, a grasp of courtly nuance, and a presence that lingered longer than expected for a girl not yet of age. Her dark, curious eyes, her quick tongue, and the grace with which she moved through any room would become her signature, traits that intrigued and unsettled in equal measure. Her path veered from England early. Around the age of 12 or 13, Anne was sent abroad, a privilege and a strategy. She began in the refined court of Margaret of Austria in Mechelen, modern-day Belgium, where diplomacy and decorum were daily bread. There, Anne learned not just languages and etiquette, but the art of observation, the quiet skill of knowing when to speak and when silence could win. From Mechelen, she moved on to France, serving Queen Claude. The French court, worldly, opulent, and politically charged, was her finishing school. She absorbed continental sophistication like air, fashion, flirtation, religious reform, art, and above all, wit sharpened by exposure to power. Anne was no mere lady-in-waiting. She was a sponge, soaking up every advantage foreign courts could offer. By the time she returned to England in 1522, Anne was no longer a provincial girl. She was something new, a woman formed by two courts, fluent in charm and calculation. In the candlelit halls of English nobility, she did not blend in. She stood out. People noticed. They always did. There was a charge to her presence, a kind of contained lightning. Anne was not classically beautiful, but compelling, someone you looked at twice, someone you remembered. Her return to court was meant to be a next step in the family's slow, steady rise. But Anne, with her education, elegance, and undaunted spirit, was no longer content to simply rise. She was poised to disrupt. She had learned the language of power. Now, back on English soil, she was ready to speak it. Next, we enter the court she would soon ignite, not with scandal just yet, but with a performance that would catch a king's eye. Anne Boleyn was about to be noticed. Anne Boleyn arrived at the English court not as a thunderclap, but as a storm in silk, slow building, charged with a heat no one saw coming. She returned from France in 1522, appointed as maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon, a respectable role for a young noblewoman. But Anne was no ordinary court fixture. She walked differently, spoke differently, looked directly into people's eyes when others cast theirs downward. Where most courtiers fluttered politely in the Queen's orbit, Anne moved with deliberate grace, her presence humming with quiet defiance. Her French fluency flowed easily in conversations, peppered with wit, honed in the salons of Mechlin and Blois. Her laughter rang out clearly, never forced, never demure. At a court where most women were expected to be soft-spoken and compliant, Anne was bold-eyed and sharp-tongued, her charm laced with intelligence that made even seasoned courtiers pause. She didn't merely follow fashion, she redefined it. Anne wore French cuts with daring confidence, square necklines that revealed her long, graceful neck, sleeves edged in daring colors, headdresses that whispered rebellion. Everything about her signaled someone not quite English, not quite safe, and for that very reason, utterly magnetic. It didn't take long for the court to buzz. Whispers trailed behind her like perfume, about her time in France, her rumored lovers, her quick wit. But far from damaging her, the rumors fueled the fire. She became a fascination, the kind of woman others envied, admired, and feared all at once. And King Henry VIII, he noticed. At first it was glances, then dances, then gifts, notes, and unmistakable attention. Anne had been preceded at court by her sister, Mary Boleyn, who had already enjoyed the king's brief and forgettable affection. Most assumed Anne would follow the same path, a short-lived affair, another notch on the king's belt. But Anne had learned well abroad. She knew what power looked like, and more importantly, what it cost. When Henry made his intentions known, Anne did something no one expected. She refused. No mistress's chambers, no secret visits, no whispered trysts. Anne would not be used and forgotten. She would not become another Mary. If Henry wanted her, he would have to earn her and elevate her. The refusal was radical, dangerous, electrifying. Suddenly, she wasn't just a flirtatious courtier, she was a challenge. And for a king used to instant obedience, Anne's defiance wasn't a deterrent. It was an irresistible spark. With her refusal, Anne shifted the balance. She was no longer simply in the court. She was reshaping it. Next, we follow the escalation of this dangerous game. Anne's gamble against the Queen, against tradition, and against the full weight of history. She wouldn't give her body. She would ask for a crown. By 1525, Anne Boleyn was no longer a court novelty. She was a force of gravity, and Henry VIII, a king caught in her orbit. He sent her jewels, penned her letters filled with longing, humility, even desperation, unthinkable sentiments for a man raised to believe his will was divine. He built her a private apartment in his palace, a space that should have marked the beginning of an affair. But Anne refused to move in. She refused everything, not the attention, nor the gifts. Those she accepted with grace and careful calculation. But the role of mistress? Never. Anne understood what it meant to give in. Her sister Mary had. Countless other women had. They received fleeting favor, then quiet dismissal. Anne wanted more, not a moment of power but a place in history. And so with every smile that turned into a cool retreat, every witty reply followed by a strategic absence, Anne deepened the king's obsession. She offered a crown, not her body, and dared him to reach for it. The scandal that followed was like a spark in dry hay. Queen Catherine of Aragon still held her place, loved by the people and fiercely defended by her powerful nephew, Emperor Charles V. The court was divided. Nobles whispered behind closed doors. Ambassadors from Rome watched with alarm. Henry's request to annul his marriage ignited a storm of resistance, led by Catherine's allies and culminating in the Pope's refusal to grant the divorce. But Anne didn't flinch. She kept her distance, both physically and emotionally. No secret meetings, no midnight visits. She made herself a future queen, even if the world refused to name her one. Her restraint wasn't just moral, it was political genius. The less she yielded, the more Henry burned. The more he burned, the more reckless he became. By denying him what he expected, what every other woman had given freely, Anne flipped the script of courtship and kingship alike. She forced Henry to consider the unthinkable, breaking with Rome, challenging centuries of church authority, and rewriting the spiritual law of the land, all for her. To some, she was a temptress, to others, a prophet of change, but none could deny her influence. Anne, daughter of an ambitious diplomat, stood at the heart of a national crisis, one that shook England's foundations and set the stage for revolution. Even now, she never said yes. She said, "Make me queen." And Henry, torn between passion and pride, began to dismantle the very world he had sworn to protect, brick by brick, law by law, for a woman who had yet to give him anything, except her unshakable terms. Next, the storm intensifies. Henry declares war, not on a rival king, but on the church itself. All to place one woman on England's throne. Henry VIII's pursuit of Anne Boleyn became more than a royal affair. It became a national fracture, one woman's ambition cracking the very bones of a kingdom. His campaign to annul his marriage to Queen Catherine was once whispered inside corridors. Now, it thundered across Europe. What began as a king's desire became a kingdom unmoored by love, drifting from its traditions, its alliances, and even its faith. At court, factions sharpened like blades. Anne's supporters, young reformists, opportunists, and the Boleyn family, saw her as a rising star, the promise of a New England. To them, she was brilliance incarnate, witty, cultured, and bold enough to stand equal beside a king. But Catherine's allies were no less fierce. Older nobles, devout churchmen, and the common people clung to the queen they had loved for decades. They whispered of sin, of injustice, of a nation cursed if she were cast aside. Foreign powers took notice. Emperor Charles V, Catherine's nephew and one of the most powerful rulers in Europe, was livid. He warned Rome that an insult to Catherine would be an insult to the Holy Roman Empire. Behind closed doors, he threatened war. The Pope, caught between kings and crowns, stalled, hedged, refused. But Henry would not be denied. In a bold, earth-shattering move, he broke from the Pope entirely. England, long a loyal daughter of the Catholic Church, was suddenly its rebel. Henry declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, cleaving faith from Rome with a signature and a sword. Priests swore new oaths. Monasteries braced for storm. The old order was collapsing. And at the eye of it all stood Anne, no longer a courtier, no longer a mistress, now a queen. In 1533, she was crowned with full ceremony. Unlike Catherine, whose coronation had been shared with Henry, Anne walked alone, the symbol of a new regime. Pregnant with what many hoped was a male heir, she ascended the throne not by divine favor, but by defiant will. Bells rang. Crowds gathered. But beneath the pageantry, England groaned. Some celebrated. Others wept. Many prayed. for mercy, for clarity, or for Anne's downfall. What Anne had won was not just a crown, but the ire of a continent. What Henry had done was not just marry again, but unchain a revolution. The throne was hers now, but the peace was gone. Next, the world watches breathlessly. Will Anne bear the son England demands, or will her crown, like her rise, rest on the edge of a knife? Anne Boleyn had done the impossible. She had toppled a queen, defied a church, and won a king. Her secret marriage to Henry VIII in January 1533 was a quiet triumph, conducted in hushed tones behind palace walls. But months later, when she was crowned Queen of England, it was thunderously public, a crown won through fire. Her coronation shimmered with symbolism. She rode through London in golden cloth, beneath arches of roses and silk. Trumpets flared, children sang. Anne was radiant, draped in vibrant colors and jewels that caught the summer sun. Her very presence demanded notice, sharp of wit, sharper of tongue, and unwilling to play the submissive queen. But even in her moment of glory, danger coiled beneath her feet. The people were divided. Some stared in awe, swept up by her boldness, her energy, her unmistakable charisma. But others turned away in silence. Whispers followed her carriage. The usurper, the witch, the concubine queen. Many still adored Catherine, who, despite being banished from court, remained a symbol of enduring virtue to much of the populace. And then came the birth. On a September day in 1533, Anne gave birth to her first child. The court waited with bated breath, prayers on their lips, Henry's anticipation like a taut bowstring. But when the swaddled infant was presented, it was not a prince, but a daughter. They named her Elizabeth. For Anne, it was both a personal joy and a political blow. The baby was healthy, spirited, and golden-haired, but she was not the male heir Anne had promised. Henry masked his disappointment with strained celebration, but the court saw the truth in his silence. Anne's enemies rejoiced. Her crown had rested on her womb, and now cracks had begun to show. Still, she pushed on. Anne refused to be cowed. She surrounded herself with reformers and thinkers, patronized the arts, and advocated for Protestant ideas that thrilled some and horrified others. She debated theologians, advised her husband, and wielded power with an elegance that rivaled kings. But power is rarely without cost. Behind the scenes, whispers grew louder. Courtiers who once fawned over Anne now shifted loyalties, sensing instability. Catherine's supporters seized on every misstep. Anne's sharp tongue, once admired, was now seen as arrogance. Her passion, once alluring, now labeled as ambition, run wild. The pressure intensified. She was soon pregnant again, and this time, more than hope hung in the air. Henry's patience, England's peace, and Anne's very safety depended on the outcome. She knew it. Everyone did. The stakes were no longer love or status. They were survival. In private, Anne prayed. In public, she dazzled. But all the while, her position swayed like a crown in a gale. She had climbed to the peak of power. But in Tudor England, the higher the ascent, the sharper the fall. Next comes the unraveling. The failed births, the shifting glances, the queen who had burned so brightly now shadowed by doubt. The cracks in Anne's reign were no longer hairline fractures. They were beginning to split wide open. Anne Boleyn's throne, once so defiantly seized, began to wobble beneath her. Her enemies had waited patiently, and now the winds were turning. Her first miscarriage came as a shock. Then came another. This time, a son, lost too soon. Each miscarriage landed like a hammer blow against the foundation of her fragile queenship. She had promised Henry sons, heirs, strength. Instead, she offered grief and empty cradles. Henry's disappointment darkened into distance. The man who had once upended a kingdom for her now found solace in another's silence, Jane Seymour. Quiet, compliant. Everything Anne was not. Where Anne had sparked with fire, Jane whispered with stillness. Anne could feel it. The shifting glances, the growing silences, the way Henry's eyes lingered elsewhere. At court, her supporters thinned. Nobles who had once smiled in her presence now whispered behind her back. Many had never accepted her, and with her womb failing to deliver security, their resentment sharpened. Commoners still called her names in alleyways, the same ones they had used when she first rose. She had never truly won them over, only outpaced their hatred. Anne fought back the only way she knew how, with defiance. She confronted Henry, challenged his mood swings, reminded him, sometimes too fiercely, of all they had risked together. But the old spark that had once ignited his desire now only fanned his irritation. He began to avoid her. Courtship had turned into calculation. And behind the scenes, Thomas Cromwell watched. He had been her ally once. Together, they had engineered Catherine's fall. But now Anne clashed with his growing power. She questioned his reforms, criticized his wealth, and even hinted he had gone too far. Cromwell, ever the survivor, made a choice. He would not go down with the Queen. Instead, he would help bring her down. The cracks in Anne's reign were no longer hidden. They were spreading, through the court, through Henry's affections, and through the very structure of the Tudor court she had helped reshape. What had once made her untouchable, her cleverness, her independence, her unwillingness to yield, was now ammunition in the hands of her enemies. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, still wore her crown. But the scaffold's shadow had begun to stretch across her path. Next comes betrayal. Cromwell would set the stage, the charges would be invented, the Queen would be watched, and history would hold its breath. Thomas Cromwell had once stood in Anne Boleyn's shadow. He had helped her rise, twisted laws in her favor, and cheered her coronation. But power breeds uneasy partnerships, and Anne had made the fatal mistake of believing her influence was permanent. Now, the shadow turned against its maker. Cromwell moved quietly, methodically, like a man laying traps in a dim hallway. He knew Henry's frustration, had heard the king's sighs, seen his lingering glances toward Jane Seymour. He also knew the Queen was no longer untouchable. Her sharp tongue, her miscarriages, her waning favor, it all added up to permission. The accusations began with a whisper. Adultery, with a court musician. Incest, with her own brother. Treason, for dreaming of the king's death. Each claim was more absurd than the last, but absurdity wasn't a defense in Tudor England, especially when the king wanted peace and the minister wanted favor. Cromwell spun the charges like a spider spins silk, a net woven of lies, catching both truth and fiction in its delicate strands. Evidence was coerced. Confessions were extracted under pressure. Loyal courtiers were questioned until they broke. Some names were offered under duress, others out of fear. Anne's court grew colder. Friends grew silent. Even her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, kept his distance. Her former allies bowed politely but offered no protection. They sensed what was coming. In a place where survival depended on foresight, no one wanted to be seen clinging to a falling star. And Jane Seymour? She rose silently, demurely, a pale moon ascending as Anne's sun began to set. She said little. She smiled just enough. She refused Henry's gifts, then accepted his hand. A different tactic, but no less ambitious. Anne, meanwhile, felt the air tightening around her. She heard the rumors, saw the suspicious glances. But she had survived worse. She still wore the crown. She still carried the title of queen. Surely, she thought, Henry would not believe these charges. But Cromwell wasn't leaving it to chance. On May 2, 1536, Anne Boleyn was summoned to appear before the king's council. She arrived dressed in dignity, confusion, and a flicker of defiance. By day's end, she was under arrest, taken to the Tower of London, not as royalty, but as a prisoner. The Queen's apartments were no longer hers. In their place, cold stone, barred windows, and a traitor's future. The trial would be swift, the verdict predetermined. But for now, Anne waited, surrounded by the very silence she had once commanded. The net had closed, and even she could not untangle it. Next comes the trial, the spectacle, and the fall. The woman who changed a kingdom would now face its judgment. The room was heavy with velvet and vengeance. Once, these same nobles had bowed to Queen Anne, smiled at her wit, hung on her words. Now, seated as her judges, their gazes were colder, their loyalty hollow. Power had shifted. Anne Boleyn sat not as queen, but as accused, on trial for her crown, her life, and the sins she did not commit. She stood with her back straight, eyes unwavering, no tears, no pleading. "I am the queen," she reminded them, not in arrogance, but in truth. She invoked the sacred rite of her coronation, the anointing with holy oil before God and England. That moment, she said, could not be undone with rumor or envy. She questioned the evidence, pointing to dates that made adultery impossible, witnesses who were conveniently absent. Her voice, clear and sharp, cut through the pomp. But the verdict had been written long before the trial began. The charges, incest, adultery, treason, rested on contradiction and conjecture. The jury ignored the gaps, the impossibilities. Cromwell had done his work too well. Even Anne's uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, presided coldly, a man burying his own blood for the sake of the crown. When the sentence was delivered, Anne did not falter. Death. By burning or beheading, the king would decide. She bowed her head only briefly. Then she looked up, not with despair, but with iron composure. The courtroom saw not a broken woman, but a queen stripped of title, not of spirit. Her enemies had taken everything, except her dignity. As she was led away, she did not scream or beg. She walked with quiet defiance, the train of her gown brushing the stone floor like the final whisper of her reign. The tower awaited, and so did her end. Next comes Anne's final days, faith, reflection, and the gallows' quiet shadow. The tower was cold, but Anne remained warm with resolve. She walked its narrow confines like a queen still in court, her spine straight, her gaze distant but unafraid. The stone walls that had witnessed so many royal secrets now held their breath for one final chapter, and Anne, betrayed, condemned, was serene. She spent her last hours in prayer. Whispers to God filled the gloom, not as pleas for rescue, but as reflections on life, sin, and grace. She prayed for her daughter Elizabeth, for Henry, even for those who condemned her. Her voice, her composure, baffled even her jailers. "I am not afraid," she told her ladies as they wept. "I have done no crime." There was dark wit still flickering in her like a dying flame, refusing to go out quietly. She joked softly about the swordsman summoned from Calais. "I hear he is very good. I shall have little pain." She teased about her little neck, a gallows humor both macabre and regal. It unsettled those who thought she would crumble. She comforted her ladies more than they did her, brushing tears from their cheeks, instructing them with gentle firmness. Her thoughts were already past this world. And even as she faced the end, Henry's final betrayal pressed its weight. He was preparing to wed Jane Seymour, the quiet woman Anne had once dismissed as unthreatening. The wedding was already whispered of, the next chapter being inked before the last line of Anne's was closed. But Anne said nothing bitter. She had no time left for envy. On the morning of her death, she rose early. She dressed with care. No panic, no trembling. A simple gown of damask, deep crimson beneath a gray mantle. Her long dark hair was gathered beneath a plain headdress. She adorned herself not for vanity, but as a final act of control. "A queen must meet death as she met the court," she murmured. Her body may have been sentenced, but her soul would be sovereign. As she walked to the scaffold, her steps were steady. The crowd, expecting a broken woman, instead saw a monarch in spirit. She spoke not to accuse, but to forgive. "I die a faithful servant to the king. May God have mercy on my soul." Then she knelt, eyes raised to the heavens, lips still murmuring her final prayer. The French swordsman, swift and silent, waited for her signal. She looked forward, calm, dignified, and in one final breath, released her life. Anne Boleyn died with courage, cloaked in grace. Her story did not end there, for her daughter would one day rise to shape England's fate. But even before Elizabeth's reign, Anne's spirit lingered, as the woman who defied kings, redefined queenship, and met death not with fear, but with fire. Next, the echoes of Anne's life and the daughter who bore her legacy. The sword fell swiftly. There was no scream, no struggle, just silence, broken by the soft thud of a life undone. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, was gone. Her calm final words, "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul," still echoed in the hush that followed. It was a death as dignified as her life had been defiant, a final note of courage, clear and unwavering. She was buried quickly, without ceremony. No royal tomb, no marble effigy. Just an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, a quiet resting place for a woman who had shaken the very foundations of England. Her crown was stripped from memory, but not from history, because Anne did not vanish. She lived on, in the sharp wit of a red-haired daughter who watched the court with wary eyes. Elizabeth, born in the shadow of her mother's fall, would one day rise in radiant defiance of that legacy. She carried Anne's fire, a legacy not of scandal, but of steel. Where her mother had challenged convention, Elizabeth would command it. Where Anne had been broken by power, Elizabeth would master it. Anne's death marked not only the end of a life, but the beginning of an era. Her execution severed more than her head. It helped cleave England from Rome. Her rise, her marriage, and her fall had set into motion a chain of reforms, rebellions, and religious shifts. The Church of England, the dissolution of the monasteries, the redefinition of monarchy, all traced in part to Anne's unyielding presence in Henry's world. She was a catalyst, not a casualty. Her enemies tried to erase her, to reduce her to treason and adultery. But history did not oblige. Instead, Anne emerged across the centuries as something more, a woman punished for ambition, remembered for courage, and honored for the daughter she left behind. In the quiet of her grave, the stones did not speak. But her legacy shouted across time, because courage does not always survive, but when it does, it multiplies. And somewhere, centuries later, across a stormy ocean, that spirit of resistance, of boldness in the face of tradition, would stir again. Next, a harbor, a rebellion steeped in tea, and a spark that would light a revolution. Beneath the polished veneer of colonial loyalty, something was burning. Not yet a blaze, but a slow, persistent heat. A fire smoldering under loyalty, fed by taxes, restrictions, and the creeping sense that distant kings did not see colonial lives, only colonial profits. At first, the protests were polite. Petitions were drafted with elegant language and hopeful signatures. Delegates spoke of rights, not rebellion. They called themselves loyal subjects, asking only for fairness. But as Parliament doubled down, issuing tax after tax, from sugar to stamps, the tone sharpened. No taxation without representation. It became more than a slogan. It was a line drawn in the sand. The colonists had no voice in the British Parliament, yet their pockets were being emptied to fund an empire they could not influence. It wasn't just unfair. It was tyranny by ink and seal. The streets began to swell with noise. In Boston, protests flared with particular heat. This was no quiet town. It was the heart of defiance, pulsing with pamphlets, speeches, and secret meetings. And at the center of it all were the Sons of Liberty, a band of shopkeepers, printers, and firebrands who refused to kneel. They stirred the city like a spoon in a simmering pot. Then came the Boston Massacre. March 5th, 1770. Snow on the cobblestones, taunts in the air. British soldiers, nervous and armed. A crowd, angry and growing. A shot. Then 5 colonists dead. The name itself, massacre, became fuel for the resistance. Engravings and newspaper reports spread like wildfire. The Crown called it self-defense. The colonies called it murder. The polite petitions began to curl at the edges, blackened by rage. Still, Parliament pressed on. In 1773, the Tea Act was passed. Not a massive burden, but a symbol. It allowed the British East India Company to sell tea directly to the colonies, bypassing local merchants. It was cheaper tea, but it came with a bitter message. You will drink what we decide, and you will thank us for it. It was the final insult. Tea had long been a comfort, a warm ritual in every colonial home. But now, even tea became political. Every steaming cup felt like surrender. Every ship that docked with crates of East India tea felt like a challenge. The colonists had begged, debated, protested. They had sent letters and delegates. But this latest act felt different. It didn't just reach into their purses, it tugged at their pride. And so, something snapped. No more speeches, no more parchment. Only a plan whispered between patriots in Boston taverns. The ships would not be allowed to unload. The king would not dictate their customs. The harbor would be a message. The fire that had simmered for years was now ready to leap skyward. Next, the Boston Tea Party, a night of storm, disguise, and revolution steeped in salt water. To Parliament, the Tea Act of 1773 seemed clever, an economic patch for a struggling British East India Company. By allowing the company to sell tea directly to the colonies, bypassing colonial merchants, the tea would be cheaper, even after the existing tax. But to the colonists, it was no gift. It was a bargain laced with chains. Cheaper tea didn't mask the bitter truth. Buying it meant accepting Britain's right to tax them without consent. It was not about cost, it was about principle. And Boston, proud and defiant, would not be bought. Outrage spread like fire on parchment. Pamphlets warned of tyranny hidden in teacups. Merchants feared ruin. Mothers vowed to pour their kettles empty before serving taxed tea. The Sons of Liberty sprang into action, declaring a boycott and organizing massive public meetings. Their message was clear. Not one crate would be unloaded. 3 ships sat anchored in Boston Harbor, the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver. Each held hundreds of chests of East India tea, but the colonists refused to allow them to land or unload. Under British law, the cargo had to be either unloaded and taxed or sent back. But the governor, loyal to the crown, forbade the ship's departure until the duty was paid. A deadlock gripped the city. Day after day, tension simmered. British troops patrolled the streets. Crowds gathered along the wharves. And at the center of it all stood the Old South Meeting House, where thousands crammed inside and spilled into the square outside, demanding action. It was more than just a church or hall. It was a crucible of revolution. On December 16th, 1773, the final deadline loomed. If the tea wasn't unloaded or returned by nightfall, customs officials would seize it and force payment. Inside the meeting house, patriot leaders like Samuel Adams, Dr. Joseph Warren, and John Hancock spoke passionately. Voices echoed off timbered walls. Arguments clashed like swords. Then came the signal. Samuel Adams stood and declared, "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." A phrase rehearsed, perhaps, but understood. In the cold twilight outside, dozens of men disguised as Mohawk warriors stirred in the shadows. The waiting was over. Boston had made its choice. Next, the Boston Tea Party. A thunderous night when rebellion steeped in the salt black water. The Old South Meeting House pulsed with energy, a cauldron of rebellion thick with sweat, smoke, and fury. Thousands had gathered by candlelight, the air sharp with the cold of December and the heat of protest. The walls had heard impassioned speeches and stomping boots, but now they waited for something else, a decision. Samuel Adams stood at the pulpit, eyes scanning the restless crowd. His voice, calm yet firm, broke the tension. This meeting can do nothing more to save the country. To the untrained ear, it was a resignation. To the Sons of Liberty, it was the signal. Outside, in the bitter darkness of Boston's winter, men stirred, shadows cloaked in purpose. Dozens emerged from alleys and taverns, their faces smeared with soot, feathers woven into their hair. They had disguised themselves as Mohawk warriors not to mimic, but to declare a new identity. Free men, no longer subjects, no torches, no drunken chants, just the methodical march to Griffin's Wharf. 3 ships loomed against the harbor mist: Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver, their hulls groaning with British East India Company tea. Guarded, but not protected. The disguised men climbed aboard with quiet determination, hatchets in hand, not to steal, but to destroy. They worked with discipline born of fury. Chest by chest, they split open the crates, 342 in all, each thudding onto the deck before its contents cascaded into the black water below. The harbor frothed with the scent of ruin, a sea steeped in defiance. Tea leaves clung to ships, pilings and boots like confetti at a revolution's wake. Not a single crate was pocketed, not a drop of rum was touched, not one sailor was harmed. This was not chaos. It was a message, loud, deliberate, and undeniable. Spectators watched in eerie silence, lining the wharf, the rooftops, the frozen docks. Some clutched coats tighter. Others held children aloft to see history unfold. A few British officers lingered at a distance, unsure whether to intervene. None did. When the work was done, the men vanished back into the dark. No victory shouts, no claims of glory. The only sound left was the lap of tea-slick waves against the wood and the quiet murmur of the stunned crowd. By morning, the harbor looked like an English breakfast turned bitter. Soggy tea clumps drifting in icy swells, a reminder that something irreversible had begun. The Crown would respond swiftly, harshly. But that night, Boston had spoken, not with bullets, but with uncompromising defiance. Next, the Empire strikes back. Punishments descend as Britain tightens its grip. Morning light revealed the harbor still stained with rebellion. The tea was gone, but the ripples remained. Boston hummed with a strange duality. Pride coursed through rebel veins, while horror gripped loyalist hearts. Families, once neighbors, now eyed each other across widening ideological lines. Some toasted the audacity of the Tea Party. Others whispered of treason over breakfast. It was a city split by tea, and no one knew what would come next. The answer arrived swiftly from across the Atlantic. Parliament, enraged and determined to restore order, passed a series of laws so punishing they became known not by their official name, the Coercive Acts, but by a colonial one, the Intolerable Acts. The most devastating blow came first. Boston's port was closed. No goods in, no goods out. Commerce, lifeblood of the city, choked in a single decree. Wharves stood eerily still. Sailors drifted unemployed. Markets withered. Hunger whispered at the door. Other acts followed, each more suffocating. The Massachusetts Government Act stripped the colony of self-rule. The Administration of Justice Act allowed British officials to be tried in England, beyond local reach. The Quartering Act forced colonists to house and feed British soldiers, now a hostile presence in their homes. What Britain intended as a warning became a spark. Across the colonies, a different fire ignited, not of protest, but of solidarity. Wagons rolled toward Boston from as far as the Carolinas and Pennsylvania, loaded with flour, blankets, candles, and resolve. The suffering of one city became a rallying cry for all. In taverns and town halls, words like liberty, tyranny, and union took on sharper edges. That September in Philadelphia, the First Continental Congress convened. Delegates from 12 colonies, diverse in culture, divided by distance, sat at the same table. Some preached caution, others demanded action. But all agreed on one thing: Boston could not stand alone. It was no longer about tea. It was about power, dignity, and the right to self-govern. Resolutions were drafted. Boycotts were planned. Petitions were sent. But beneath it all stirred a sense that the ground was shifting, that words alone might not hold back what was coming. As winter approached, the colonies braced. The king refused to relent. The people refused to submit. What began in the harbor had reached the halls of empire and echoed back through every colonial village and farm. The cost of defiance had been tallied, and still, the people stood. Next, the revolution begins, not with declarations, but with marching boots and musket fire at dawn. The tea had long since soaked into the harbor floor, but its echo thundered across the continent. What began as a defiant act of protest, chests split open in moonlight, had become far more. It was a spark that lit a continent. In the months after the Boston Tea Party, the British government tightened its grip. The intolerable acts were meant to isolate and punish, but instead, they forged something unthinkable: unity. From the cold hills of New Hampshire to the warm fields of Georgia, colonies once divided by dialect and trade began to see themselves as one people, not just colonists, but Americans. And with unity came preparation. Farmers became militiamen. Tradesmen cleaned old muskets and cast bullets in secret. Taverns echoed with talk of liberty, of rights granted not by kings, but by nature. In hidden groves and candle-lit barns, militias drilled, led not by officers of noble birth, but by blacksmiths, preachers, and schoolteachers. These were not armies, but they would become one. And then came April 1775. British troops, under orders to seize colonial weapons in Concord, marched through the Massachusetts countryside. But the colonists were waiting. In Lexington, the first shot rang out. No one could say who fired it. A nervous hand? A twitch in the dark? But it didn't matter. It was the shot heard round the world. By the day's end, at Concord's North Bridge, smoke rose, and British soldiers fell back toward Boston, bloodied and stunned. Farmers had stood against the Empire, and lived. In Boston, the city that had become the heart of resistance, windows shuttered and cannons bristled. The British held the town, but the countryside held the will. Around the city, colonial militias dug trenches and raised their banners. Boston was no longer merely a place. It had become a symbol, a defiant ember glowing in the dark, refusing to be stamped out. Across the colonies, minds shifted. The dream of reconciliation faded. The word loyalty lost its comfort. More and more, people stopped speaking of British rights and began speaking of natural ones, of independence, of revolution. In the span of a year, the people had changed. They had stopped asking and started becoming. They were no longer British subjects demanding fairness. They were Americans, ready to build something entirely new, even if it had to be carved out of fire and war. The world tilted. The revolution had begun, not with a declaration, but with a musket's flash in a morning mist. Next, thousands of years before Boston's rebellion, another civilization rose, not with weapons, but with ingenuity. Let us journey far back in time to Caral, where pyramids met the wind and silence shaped greatness. In the heart of Peru's Soup Valley, where sand meets silence and the sky feels ancient, lies something wholly unexpected, a forgotten city resting beneath centuries of dust and myth. To the untrained eye, it was once just a scattering of mounds. But beneath those windswept humps lay Caral, a mirage of stone and a barren sea. For millennia, it slept undisturbed, its builders long vanished, its purpose obscured by time. It wasn't conquest or legend that brought it back into the light. It was quiet persistence. In the 1990s, Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady looked beyond what others dismissed. With patience and vision, she uncovered something astonishing, a civilization that rose before pharaohs ever lifted a stone. Caral wasn't just old, it was ancient. 5,000 years ago, when much of the world still whispered in tribal tongues, this city was singing with human order. Pyramids climbed the desert. Circular plazas echoed with music and ritual. People gathered not in caves, but in carefully planned neighborhoods, aligned with celestial paths and river rhythms. Historians reeled. Egypt's pyramids had long held the banner of first glory. But here was a contender, a cradle older than time, rising from the sand without the need for war or written conquest. The city sprawled across 150 acres, with 6 monumental pyramids, wide ceremonial plazas, residential quarters, and even a possible amphitheater. Everything spoke of intent, of harmony with nature, of a people who knew how to shape stone and space with purpose. There were no walls, no signs of warfare. Caral seemed to be built on cooperation, not conquest, a peaceful power, a society where music, trade, and ritual defined strength. How had they done it? How had they endured in such an unforgiving place? The desert, vast and dry, posed a daily challenge. The sun scorched. The river soup, while life-giving, was unpredictable. Yet the people of Caral did not flee. They adapted. They terraced their crops, engineered canals, and learned to read the land's moods. Their buildings breathed with the wind, designed to withstand earthquakes long before seismology existed. In the silence of that forgotten valley, a miracle of human ingenuity had bloomed and almost vanished. For centuries, no one knew. Until a woman with a trained eye and a stubborn heart swept the dust away. Caral asks us to rethink beginnings, to see that civilization did not start with kings and battles, but perhaps with plazas and flutes, with shared labor and communal dreams. Next, how did Caral's people survive where so many would have perished? Join us as we explore their triumph over the harsh desert, where wind and sand tested every choice and harmony became survival. The Soup Valley was no gentle cradle. It was a land that dared life to try, a place where the earth cracked beneath the sun's gaze and rain rarely offered relief. The river that sliced through the valley, the Supi, was both a blessing and a fickle thread, vanishing for months, then surging without warning. Yet here, in this stern, sun-seared place, the people of Caral carved out not just survival, but a flourishing civilization. Their first triumph? Water. They didn't wait for the rains. They engineered hope. With stone tools and naked determination, they built irrigation canals that wound through the valley like veins of water in the desert's heart. These channels carried the Soup's seasonal flow to thirsty fields, transforming dust into green. They didn't fight the land. They listened to it. They studied the river's rhythms, watched the winds, and planted according to nature's pulse. From this careful observation, a surprising abundance grew. Cotton thrived in the arid soil, not to eat, but to trade. Its soft fibers became thread, fishing nets, and cloth, fueling an economy beyond the valley's walls. Downstream, along the Pacific coast, other communities fished the sea. Caral's people didn't compete, they collaborated. Cotton flowed to the coast, fish and shells came upriver in return. It was a system built not on domination, but on balance. Even their tools reflected harmony. There were no weapons in Caral, no swords, no arrowheads. Instead, archaeologists found flutes carved from condor bones and panpipes fashioned from deer femurs, instruments of ceremony, not conquest. This was a culture built on ritual, trade, and knowledge, not war. They built agricultural terraces that softened the valley's slopes, minimizing erosion and maximizing every drop of moisture. Windbreaks and stone borders protected fields from sudden gusts. Every structure, every ditch, spoke of design honed by generations. Life in Caral wasn't easy. It required constant vigilance, adaptation, and communal effort. But the reward was stability, and from that stability came greatness. Their success in taming the desert allowed something greater to rise. Monuments of awe, structures not needed for survival, but born from its triumph. Because when a people master their environment, they begin to dream higher. And Caral dreamed in pyramids. Next, in the heart of the desert, Caral raised temples that kissed the sky. Step into the monumental architecture that still humbles modern eyes, where ancient builders summoned the sacred from stone. Rising from the dry earth like a forgotten deity, the pyramid mayor stood as a stone giant, kissing the sky. At its base, broad staircases reached skyward in slow, deliberate ascent. At its summit, flattened and open to the heavens, rituals once unfolded under the same stars we see today. This was not a monument to the dead. There were no tombs within its chambers, no royal remains. This pyramid lived for the living. It was built for ceremony, for community, for the dance between Earth and cosmos. But beyond its beauty lay brilliance. The builders of Caral understood that the land could rise and tremble. So they did something astonishing. At the pyramid's heart were woven reed bags filled with stones, a technique both simple and profoundly advanced. These flexible cores acted like cushions during earthquakes, absorbing shock and sparing the structure. A city in the desert, made to breathe with the earth, not shatter beneath it. And Caral was not just one pyramid, but many. Smaller mounds and stepped platforms surrounded broad circular plazas where hundreds could gather. From these sunken arenas, voices would rise, prayers, chants, perhaps decisions that shaped the valley's fate. Every angle, every wall, held purpose. Some structures aligned with solstices and equinoxes, allowing priests or astronomers to mark the path of the sun, the rise of Venus, or the cycle of seasons. To walk through Caral was to walk a calendar carved in stone, a map of heaven etched on earth. It was sacred, but not solemn. There was music, there was firelight, there was life, and all of it existed in a world without war. Unlike many ancient cities, Caral bore no scars of violence, no weapons, no fortifications, no mass graves from conquest. Its grandeur was not built on domination, but on collaboration. Its pyramids were not fortresses. They were temples of peace, raised by a society that placed knowledge, ritual, and unity above conquest. What they left behind was more than stone. It was a philosophy. That greatness can rise not only from blood and empire, but from harmony and shared purpose. And in that philosophy, Caral may stand among humanity's finest beginnings. Next, as Caral's stones weather time, its silence gives way to a darker mystery. Why did this peaceful city vanish? Step into the unanswered riddle of its fall. In a world where ancient cities often rose behind walls and were remembered by the weapons buried within them, Caral stood apart, a city of open hands. There were no battlements, no spearheads rusting in the sand, no carvings glorifying war. Instead, Caral's legacy whispered something quietly revolutionary, a civilization that chose cooperation over conquest. Surrounded by arid hills and the slow breath of the Super River, Caral flourished not through violence, but through interconnectedness. Its people wove a vast trade network that stretched from the Pacific coast to the highlands. They cultivated cotton, spun it into fishing nets, and exchanged it for anchovies, sardines, shells, and obsidian. Fishermen along the shore relied on Caral's fibers to fill their baskets. In return, the desert city was fed by the sea. It was not a network of tribute, but of reciprocity, a bond strengthened by trust, not fear. And trust extended beyond trade. At the heart of the city stood sunken plazas, vast circular spaces where the community would gather. Here, under the starlit canopy, ceremonies unfolded, shared rituals that bound farmer to priest, artisan to child. Fires flickered in rhythmic beats. Flutes and drums echoed into the night. Voices rose in harmony, not to rally for war, but to celebrate life, to mourn death, to mark the changing of the seasons. These were not spectacles of hierarchy. They were threads of unity. Leadership in Caral seemed to emerge not from brute strength, but from knowledge and spiritual insight. The city's planners had astronomical precision. The builders engineered earthquake resistance. And the priest leaders, it seems, led through wisdom, guiding planting cycles, organizing ceremonies, and ensuring the city thrived in rhythm with nature. There are no grand statues of kings here, no boasting inscriptions of conquest. Instead, the architecture itself speaks of collective purpose, of a people who found identity not in power, but in balance. Their society was not perfect. We do not know every detail, but in what they left behind, there is no trace of war. That silence is powerful. It is not emptiness, it is a message. Caral reminds us that peace is not the absence of greatness, but its own kind of triumph. That humanity has, even in its earliest chapters, chosen paths of harmony. Paths where cities rose not for domination, but for celebration, for trade, for music, for the stars. And as we walk through the remains of this desert marvel, we feel not the echoes of empire, but the heartbeat of community. A civilization that reminds us what's possible when we build with open hands instead of clenched fists. Next, from communal harmony to the soul of ritual, we descend into the sacred soundscape of Caral, where music, fire, and silence shape the human spirit. When the winds sweep through the Soup Valley, some say they still carry echoes. Notes once breathed through hollowed condor bones, rhythms born from stretched deer hide, pulses that stirred hearts before ink touched parchment. Caral was not a silent city. It was alive with sound and soul. From the great plazas at its center to the stepped terraces of its pyramids, music flowed like water through stone. Its people crafted flutes from bird bones, condors, creatures of the sky, chosen perhaps for their sacred connection to the heavens. Their breath transformed bone into melody, thin, high, haunting. Each note a whisper to the stars. Deer-hide drums, taut, warm, resonant, kept the heartbeat of communal life. Hands struck rhythm into dusk as dancers circled fires that flickered atop stone platforms. These fires weren't signals of war, but beacons of ritual. Light for the gods, warmth for the spirit. Together, these instruments composed a symphony of sand, a soundscape born not of conquest, but of celebration and reverence. Ritual in Caral was not rare or rigid. It was woven into the everyday. As the sun set and shadows lengthened, people gathered in sunken circular plazas, carved into the earth like cradles for community. There, under constellations aligned with their pyramids, they moved in rhythm, a human constellation echoing the sky. These ceremonies weren't just performance, they were pathways to the divine, anchoring the people to the cosmos, the earth, and to one another. There are no murals here of warriors with spears, no carvings of rulers crushing enemies. Caral left behind no stories of violence, no monuments to war. Its voice instead is in flutes and firelight, in the harmonies that call us to remember how people once lived without needing to conquer. Even in the silence of ruins, Caral still hums, a song of sand and stone, a song of peace and purpose, a melody older than empire, yet more enduring. Next, beyond the music and ritual, Caral reveals another wonder, its engineering genius, a testament to human intellect rising even in the harshest terrain. In a valley where rain rarely graces the soil and rivers whisper more than roar, a city rose, not by accident, but by astounding design. Caral was no accidental cluster of dwellings. It was a feat of engineering that defied its environment and redefined early civilization. They built without metal tools, without beasts of burden, and without the wheel. And yet, monuments soared. It was a dance of stone and will, millennia before cranes or concrete. Men and women labored together, hauling river stones and earth by hand, arranging materials with a precision that still puzzles engineers today. At the heart stood the pyramid mayor, its tiers stacked like ancient intentions reaching skyward. But Caral's genius wasn't just in scale, it was in foresight. These structures were designed to withstand earthquakes, no small feat in a seismic region. They used a technique as elegant as it was effective, reed bags filled with stones, packed inside walls to act as shock absorbers. When the earth trembled, these flexible fills shifted rather than shattered. Wide, stable foundations spread pressure like a sand-footed giant, firm, grounded, enduring. And it wasn't just the pyramids. Caral's entire layout was deliberate, a city of geometry and astronomy. Main structures were aligned with celestial events, a solstice shadow here, an equinox beam there. Buildings spoke to the stars as much as they served the people. The urban planning reflected deep understanding of function and flow. There were residential zones, public plazas, ceremonial hubs, all connected by broad avenues and sunken walkways. Structures were placed not only for convenience, but for climate regulation, taking advantage of prevailing winds and sun exposure. And in the desert, where life teeters on the edge, Caral mastered water. Irrigation canals snaked from the Soup River with elegant precision, veins feeding a stony body, diverting water where it was needed most. They cultivated cotton, beans, squash, and traded the fiber of their fields for fish and shells from the coast, weaving a web of commerce and sustainability. What's most astonishing is that this wasn't a city built for show. It was built to last. Caral was constructed with generations in mind, a society investing in a future they would never fully see. Each pyramid, each plaza, each irrigation trench was a commitment not just to survival, but to thriving, a legacy etched in stone and symmetry. Here, in a land where nature challenged every breath, humans responded not with conquest, but with collaboration, with the land, with the sky, with one another. But even the most brilliantly engineered cities are not immune to time. What caused Caral's decline remains a mystery, a puzzle left in windswept stone and silent plazas. Next, as Caral fades into the sands of history, we shift to another mystery. Pompeii, a city silenced not by drought or decay, but in a single fiery breath. At its height, Caral thrived, a city of pyramids, music, and trade, carved into a desert that should have resisted it. And yet, despite its brilliance, despite its peaceful order, Caral did not endure. It did not fall in fire or war, but in silence. There was no last battle, no smoke curling from toppled stones. Instead, it was a slow unweaving, like a city slipping into dreams, its heart still beating faintly long after its voice had quieted. Why Caral was abandoned remains a question whispered across time. One theory speaks of drought, a long, slow tightening of the desert's grip. The Supa River may have shrunk, its life-giving channels drying into dust. Without water, crops failed, trade faltered, and the people, once so rooted, may have turned toward greener lands. Others suggest shifting trade routes, the delicate web that connected Caral to the coast and beyond, slowly unraveling. Perhaps newer centers rose elsewhere, and Caral's role, once central, faded into irrelevance. Or maybe it was something within. Internal decline, subtle and unseen. A breakdown in leadership, or in the shared beliefs that once bound its people together in ceremony and purpose. No signs of war, no burnt layers or crushed bones, just an absence. As though the city simply let go. Bit by bit, its plazas emptied. Fires no longer lit the night atop pyramids. Flutes no longer echoed across stone. The music stilled. Homes were left behind, not broken, just paused. Pots intact, walls standing, as though the people meant to return, but never did. And then the desert came back. Grain by grain, the wind swept in. Sand drifted into rooms, then covered them whole. Walls bowed to time. The great pyramids became mounds of earth, and for nearly 4,000 years, Caral slept, hidden beneath the dust it once defied. It was not until the late 20th century that Caral stirred again, not from within, but from without. In the 1990s, Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady led a team into the Supe Valley, following rumors of strange formations in the sand. What she uncovered would rewrite history. The city she brushed from the desert's hold was no myth. It was real. It had been old when the pyramids of Egypt were still young. Caral had not vanished. It had waited. Next, as we leave the silence of Caral, we step into Pompeii, another city preserved by time, but in fire rather than dust. Where Caral faded softly, Pompeii was frozen in a single, violent breath. For centuries, Caral slept beneath the sand, its pyramids softened into hills, its plazas forgotten by all but the wind. It was a lost city, not destroyed, but buried, patient, waiting for someone to remember. That someone was Ruth Shady, a Peruvian archaeologist with a vision sharp enough to see what others had missed. In the 1990s, she led her team into the Supa Valley, guided by nothing more than scattered rumors and unlikely formations. What she found there would redraw the map of human civilization. Each dig was a revelation. With every layer uncovered, it was as if time itself peeled back. One brushstroke at a time, Caral began to speak. a whisper from 5 millennia ago, growing louder with each discovery. They uncovered bone flutes fashioned from condors, drums made of deer hide, and delicate textiles spun from cotton, still clinging to color. But perhaps most intriguing was the presence of quipu, knotted cords used to record and communicate. Long thought to belong to the much later Inca civilization, these quipu hinted at a far older system of knowledge and order. The more they uncovered, the older Caral revealed itself to be. It predated the pyramids of Egypt. It rose while Stonehenge was still a dream. In one sweep, the timeline of civilization tilted westward, away from the old assumptions that all early greatness came from Mesopotamia, Egypt, or China. Caral had been a mother city, a cradle of complex society, not just in South America, but in the world. And unlike many of its peers, it had done so without walls or war. Its greatness came not from conquest, but from connection, wisdom, and balance. The international community took notice. In 2009, UNESCO declared Caral a World Heritage Site, calling it a masterpiece of urban planning, political cohesion, and spiritual tradition. Suddenly, the forgotten city was not only back on the map, it had become a beacon. Tourists came to walk its plazas, scholars came to study its secrets, and children in Peru learned to speak the name Caral with pride. What had once been a hidden ghost in the desert became a symbol of resilience and human ingenuity. But Caral offers more than history. It offers a message. It reminds us that great civilizations can rise without violence, that culture need not be carved in conquest, and that a people's worth is measured not by what they destroy, but by what they build, protect, and pass on. In an age often driven by division, Caral stands as a silent monument to harmony, a testament carved from sand and stone that human greatness doesn't always roar, sometimes it whispers. Next, as we leave Caral's harmony behind, we journey to Pompeii, a city not forgotten slowly, but sealed in an instant, its people frozen beneath ash, their lives paused forever by a mountain's fury. In the heart of the Soup Valley, long before empires rose and fell, Caral bloomed like a beacon in the sands, a testament to what humanity could be at its best. No walls, no weapons, just plazas, pyramids, and music that reached for the stars. It stands as quiet proof that civilization does not require conquest to thrive. At a time when many still imagine greatness born only of warlords and kings, Caral tells another story, one of cooperation, harmony, and enduring ingenuity. Here, architecture spoke of balance, not dominance. Trade connected distant coasts, not to plunder but to share. Leaders governed not through fear, but through wisdom and ritual. Their tools were flutes and firelight, not swords. Their strength lay not in fortresses, but in their ability to adapt, organize, and sustain life in a hostile land. Caral rewrote what it means to be advanced. It challenged the old narratives that complexity must stem from violence, showing instead that peace can be as powerful as power itself. And most remarkably, it did this independently of the old world. While Sumeria was writing laws and Egypt stacking stones, Caral was raising pyramids of its own, not in imitation, but in parallel. This wasn't a borrowed brilliance. It was a flame lit on its own shore, proving that the Americas, too, were a cradle of civilization. Today, Caral speaks to more than archaeologists. Its message resonates with anyone who dares to imagine a better world, not one ruled by force, but shaped by collaboration, respect, and vision. In every reed wall and woven quipu, we glimpse the possibility of a society that valued knowledge over conquest and legacy over domination. In a time when the world often feels frayed, divided by lines, hardened by conflict, Caral reminds us that there once was a city where none of that was needed, a place where people gathered under stars, not banners, and where progress was measured not in battles won, but in generations nurtured. Its lesson is timeless, that peace can build pyramids, that unity can thrive without uniformity, that the echoes of forgotten cities may hold answers for tomorrow. So let us remember Caral, not just as a wonder of the past, but as a compass for the future. Alongside the stories of queens and rebels, of revolution and resistance, let this one stand too. The story of a people who proved that a lasting legacy can be written not in blood, but in music, stone, and shared dreams.